Hello everybody, welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel for podcast number 12. Let me be the first to wish you a happy Independence Day, July 4th, if you live in America. I've got a special surprise for you at the end of the podcast today. So first up is perception reality. After that, we're going to discuss whether modern environmental policies in the West are actually a cover for something called the Nibiru Cycle. And then we get into a discussion about anthropology, archaeology, and God in a fascinating turn of events with some really interesting thoughts and questions. Then we're going to take a look ahead at Podcast XIII, which I'm announcing a week ahead of time because I am so excited about the content that I know you all are going to be blown away. Welcome, friends. If you are new, check out the video description for some interrelated videos, how to get my books, where else I am on various other platforms. So let's get started. So, is perception reality? Let's start with some definitions of terms. The Oxford Dictionary says perception is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. It also says it's a way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something, a mental impression. That's individual, isn't it, based on that definition? Reality, the Oxford Dictionary says, is a thing that is actually experienced or seen in contrast to what people might imagine realities to be. This is precisely why something like propaganda, for example, is so confusing. It's rhetorically presented as reality, but is really targeted at perception, and it is often dishonest and purposely designed to influence the perception of others. Some examples. This decision reflects the realities of the spiritual situation. This is a somewhat honest statement. Now listen to this example. The decision is perceived to be the reality of the spiritual situation by many. That's a little more vague, right? It's a non-answer in a way. In this example, we can see the trap. The decision is what I see, smell, touch, taste, hear, and may be seen by many, but not all, as the reality of the situation. Until the mid to late 20th century, there were two types of reality viewed by the various social ologies developing during their time: a shared collective reality and an individual reality. Interestingly, by 1950, with the very unethical work taking place by scientists like Skinner, whose experiments involved people, cages, various forms of deprivation, were just further evolutions of highly unethical experiments done on people by Germany and Japan during World War II. Much is said about Germany, but Japan's human experimentation was horrible, if not equal to or worse than Germany's. The shared perception was an objective set of views that, while we may not be able to attain them all at once, were uniform. Society reached for them. There was ever-expanding equality of opportunity because the standard was the same for everyone. What changed were people's various approaches to get to those objective realities and opportunities. Changes occurred based on work by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who wrote a lot about the 20th century Catechism of the Catholic Church by John Hardon. John Hardon attributes the rise of modernism in the church in the early 1900s to the College of Cardinals' conscious decision to suggest that Kantian subjectivism was the only true way to encounter the faith. In other words, not the objective truth of the faith, but hundreds of different individual thoughts about how to approach faith in the church. Another set of terms that may go hand in hand here are objective reality and subjective reality. Objective reality is external. It used to be shared and still may be some. Subjective reality is internal, individualistic. Until postmodernism, the evidentiary method, primary paper sources from the individual or subjects being discussed were considered objective sources. The birth of a form of criticism that would combat the evidentiary method of primary written sources being viewed as objective became known as higher criticism. Higher criticism gave a scholar the freedom to ask a totally subjective and often unanswerable question about these objective sources and ultimately sow seeds of doubt. This might be fine if the questions were deep and led to new thinking about the subjects, but often they just created confusion and abandonment of long-held ideas proven to work, proven true by the centuries. At some point in the West, subjective thought took over in the social, cultural, political realm in the form of mostly propaganda. Take, for example, the early 20th century newspapers surrounding the Spanish flu in 1919 and 1920. Covered on a great channel, by the way, Indy Nidell on his channels, The Great War, Time Ghost History, covering the years between the two wars, and a third channel devoted to World War II week by week. He notes that as World War I closed, casualties had been high. People were ready for a morale boost to return home and return to normalcy. That was when the flu hit, which did not actually originate in Spain, but in one of the several well-studied places. The flu did hit Spain, which was a neutral country during the war, giving international newspapers freedom to write about it and the exceptionally high mortality from the flu without sending home news to allied countries who had just lost so many of their sons to war. Britain, France, and the other allies avoided talking about the fact that this flu swept through their ranks too. In 1919 and 1920, it killed more people than the war had by a staggering number. Another example of propaganda. In World War II, Germany got the support of the German people for their September 1939 invasion of Poland by telling them that Poles had killed a number of German citizens. Likewise, when Russia wanted Finland's water ports, well, they simply told the Russian people that they were going in there to overthrow the system and help defend the workers who were being persecuted. Subjective reality is all around us. Our differences in view and opinion are based on our personal experiences, education, senses and feelings and emotions. Now, what used to be objective primary sources are subject, even in academia, to the process of being vetted for modern cultural sensitivities. Teaching has become a form of activism aimed to organize people around a certain view of an event or person. When that happens, organizations backed by strong finances overshadow ideas about truth and reality. A few examples include how discussing certain events from World War II is subject to, if not outright censorship, at least the presenter having to be extremely careful how they craft the words they present. No wonder we have accelerated losing the lessons learned from that era that led to so many tens of millions of people losing their lives. So what is objective reality today? We can't say today that hard data is even objective, can we? For two reasons. A new practice of paying for studies to get a desired outcome is common. And someone or some group are well aware that in public dialogue, liars figure and figures lie. In other words, one can look at a set of data and extract several subjective arguments from it. For example, one hypothetical study showed the surplus of cows at an all-time high this week at 82%. This is great for people who like burgers. Well, another group might say, more are being left behind in the struggle to eat meat than at any other time. 18% is too high a number, it's not fair to them, and must come down. It seems to me answering whether perception is reality, we have to ask ourselves, where does perception come from? Well, it comes from things we can see, hear, feel, smell, and taste. This feeds the process of shaping our view of the world, and that's really the only place perception really seems to matter. One could argue that framing perception in the West has become highly centralized and organized, controlled, and disseminated information with the goal of controlling narratives and gaining public support. Who controls what we see and hear? The owners of most widespread and well-funded news media sources. Hollywood, cable TV, radio, music industry, government, alphabet companies. Our churches control what we see by protecting us from the backroom minutia and stress that may come from running churches. Our parents may protect us from the realities of life until we're old enough to handle them. This would be good if pointing people to objective reality was the goal of highly organized, well-funded institutions trying to create perception. But it's not. There's a modern media personality named Eric Bischoff, who was in the professional wrestling industry for decades. He ran a company called WCW, World Championship Wrestling, during a time that WWF was the only game in town. But Bischoff actually won the TV war against WWF, going head-to-head on cable, the same time slot, different channel, for a time with his unique approach to playing with the model presenting pro wrestling. You see, wrestling works by having a baby face, a good guy, and a heel, a bad guy. The baby face was strong, courageous, patriotic, always pulling out the win like David over Goliath. Remember what Hulk Hogan used to say? "Brother, eat your vitamins and say your prayers." And as he consequently pumped up his roided muscles and waved the American flag. The heel is the bad guy. Contrary to perception, he wants the crowd to hate him, to give him heat. The boos are great. In wrestling, these matches sell. A baby-faced good guy and a hated heel who does messed up stuff. So at the end, the babyface wins the ring legitimately, but the heel and his crew come in after and beat him to a pulp and take his belt. And the redemption arc for the babyface can begin again in another town to another sold-out taping of the next episode of the weekly wrestling show. In the recent past, Eric Bischoff gave a TED Talk and pointed out how modern political cable news climate has taken a page directly from the wrestling book. There are two choices. One channel that the majority on one side agrees with, that makes them feel right and good and patriotic. When they flip to the other station, they just can't get away from, it's just crazy. These people are lost, misguided, and ignorant, and it makes us so mad. But this system breeds subjective emotional responses on purpose. It wants to get people believing that they are getting the objective truth. Social media is no better. Watch a thread. Two things are happening. We take away the important factors of face-to-face interaction so we don't see body language and we don't hear the tone. We just see words on a screen that are easy to misinterpret. People have no working awareness of perception, objectivism, subjectivism, and they go round and round and round. Your side is brainwashed and stupid. No, yours is. Well, you don't listen to facts. And then what happens? Everybody goes to Google and looks up articles that support their worldview and share it in the thread as if that's going to have any bearing at all. It's quite fascinating. Well, you just don't listen to facts, yet we're moving from objective ideas of equality of opportunity for all to the subjective individualism of equality of outcome for all, and most alarmingly, it sounds like, according to many groups, by any means. It can't be overstated how devastating this is to Western society. We must remember that our predecessors gave us a progression of organized, centralized, logical, rhetorical, and grammatical tools that gave us separation of logic and emotion. Logic and emotion can be related, but emotions are fleeting and can be irrational. Objectivism, on the other hand, is guided by critical thinking and concluded by logic answers. So, if reality is the act of perceiving that which can be brought in through the senses, is perception reality? Yes, but perception seems to be more aligned with subjective reality. Senses tell us to feel, not to use logic or critical thinking. What of those who do cling to critical thinking leading to objectivism? In postmodernism, they increasingly struggle to find a seat at the table spanning the most important topics of life. So our question may have to evolve then to, I don't know, do we share the same perception of reality? And the answer is overwhelmingly 50-50. If we agree that culture and politics are behind the wheel of ship, we have to agree that both sides of the two-party system are using rhetoric to release talking points to the public that make them feel, and ultimately align with the side that makes them feel strongest. It's a flip from objective collective reality to subjectivism that many aren't equipped to handle or even aware of in the first place. Those on the subjective side very much want to manage society, in case you haven't noticed. They don't seem aware that other groups have just as much of a right to exist as their own, even when subjectivism is the driving factor. The aim of rhetoric is to achieve having your side seen as the reality of the situation. But it is made of rhetoric, not real life. To illustrate this, recently a congressional delegation visited a housing center in a southern state between one country and its southern border. So they were experiencing an overwhelming flow of people from one side to the other illegally. They're now being housed temporarily on the north side of that southern border in an air-conditioned room, food, a bed, and clean water on top of help from community groups, lawyers, and government services. I'm sure the system is overwhelmed. There's a lot of people, human nature being what it is. Everybody's stressed, trying to help everyone else, but they're also trying to take care of themselves and their own families, and tensions get high. That's to be understood. So these are humane responses, though, overall, to fellow humans who literally cross wide swaths of desert on foot, in violation of the law, mind you. But see, the laws are vague, and they don't really offer a process in many cases. Two views, they say. These are camps like those in World War II. They used a rhetorical trick to play on people's subjective emotion, trying to convince them the perception that they were hearing was reality. One leader came out and said, "A woman was forced to drink from a toilet." Well, the actual situation was that the toilet and wash basin and water fountain were all in one units, with the sink on top and the toilet at the bottom. Of her own free will, and unable to figure out how the sink top worked, the thirsty woman, desperate to drink after crossing a desert, chose instead to drink from the toilet. See the difference? Is perception reality there? So perception can be universally shared reality in a case like that. They have competing interests almost always backed by big money, with interests in certain movements taking place in Western countries toward policies favorable to them. We are being sold different perceptions of reality from which to choose that fit in comfortably with worldviews of what we can see, smell, taste, feel, and hear. A small but growing population, critical thinkers, free thinkers, find a third option. A is not the answer. B is not the answer. I think C is the answer. This is the one time A and B get along, because they say, C, come on, you're crazy. Tinfoil hat. This leads us to what may be unanswerable and terrifying. Is reality just what most people believe or are convinced to believe? Whew. Maybe subjectively, but not objectively. What is it when small vocal groups, A or B, get to frame perception for the rest of us in public sentiment or policy? History, science, philosophy, theology. Mob mentality, mob rule. Precisely what the founders wanted to avoid. Today's most respected journalists, theologians, philosophers, people from all walks of life, believe the West must go back to objectivism as the standard. Perhaps the strongest argument, aside from critical thinking as a tool of fact-finding and discernment, is the reality that objective views can lead to equality of opportunity for all, but subjectivism can only ever lead to equality of outcome. This is because objectivism is really and may go contrary to the subjective individualistic perception attempting to be created. Remember, one deals with feelings, which are much easier to tap into. And what motivates mob rule? Feelings. Unlike objectivism, which seeks dialogue and an exchange of ideas toward consensus about reality, subjectivism has not worked in any form of government ever, for that matter. You know, I've often been hesitant to share this. Those who work in ministry, I assume, will relate with me, though. The idea that any homeless person in America is failing from the government's lack of empathy, the immorality of people who disagree, the government's resources not being used, and politicians get up and offer simple platitudes at the federal level. Nobody should be homeless. Well, of course they shouldn't. But have you ever spent time with them to figure out why many of them are homeless? So they do this out of context, ignoring all but maybe one sentence of the Bible to make a point that says, we should care for the poor, you know. Well, of course we should care for the poor, but there's a whole other book, around that sentence. Often the opposition quoting these scriptures don't believe in God in the first place. It's a rhetorical argument designed to make the opposition look insensitive and make their ideas look inconsistent. Many would love to ask those groups how much time they've spent ministering to the homeless. There are some homeless individuals content with what they are doing or are ill, but refuse help. One tries to get them housing, they don't show up for the meeting. Another tries to get family to help only to find out they are all sick of getting burned. The person in some cases is mentally ill, but refuses medicine. When this has been exhausted, all you can do is accept this person is going to be homeless by choice and offer some food from time to time, sit with them and talk and check in, make sure their health is not critical. That is one solution for the notable number of homeless in these situations. But we have certain other perceptions that have not left the comfort of the internet or a few videos and think that qualifies as an accurate perception of the world, when the objective reality is much realer on the ground. Many have well-intentioned ideas of what it is to help until they cannot control what that help looks like, and then they give up. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be right back with environmental policy and its impact potentially with the Nibiru Cycle. Are you getting tired of censorship, not being able to see what you want to see, and all the ground rules constantly getting changed? Please come over to BitChute and subscribe there at Evangelist Nick G. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Is current Western environmental policy a cover for the Nibiru Cycle? For those that don't know, Nibiru is a planet up to 30 times larger than Earth, confirmed tacitly by NASA and other countries' space programs as Planet 9, Planet X. It is on an elliptical orbit that enters our solar system every 3,600 years and perturbs the rotation of motion of Neptune and Jupiter when it comes into the area. Because of various writings and sexagesimal mathematics based on 6, which is interesting when thinking of the Nephilim with 6 fingers. Seems easy to use the fingers to count. We end up with 5, 10 because of it, yet here is 6, sexagesimal. Just an interesting, unverified thought that I found interesting. Anyway, the Sumerian mythology states that the home planet of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, also mentioned in the Bible as the sons of Anak. Joseph's Egyptian name was beloved of Anu. It also were worshipped in Egypt. It says that Sumerian writings that on one pass with our planet, known one time as Tiamat, was struck by Nibiru. Check the work of Lloyd Pye for that, which sent Nibiru into a strange orbit and cracked a big chunk off of Tiamat. I want you to look at our globe. You see, most of the land masses are pretty much interconnected. And then you get over to the Pacific Ocean, and you have a third of the world covered with ocean and small islands only. The deepest part in the Pacific Ocean in the world, the Marianas Trench. This is where this is believed to have happened. Now, so we looked at the globe there. This is apparently where it happened. A big chunk of the Earth is missing deep down, and it covers near 1/3 of the whole planet, which filled in with water over time. This interesting mythology is supported by the fact that Earth is the only planet with plate tectonics, broken and interlocking plates forced together. When they move, slide, and adjust, we get earthquakes. Later, the Anunnaki would land on Earth during one of its passes through to find gold and other resources to spray in their atmosphere to protect Nibiru from being burned up by the sun. You can check out the work of Michael Tellinger for his archaeology in South Africa that has revolutionized theories in the region. Nibiru is also known as the planet of the passing, meaning it passes Earth twice, coming in and going out, coming in and going out. It's believed by some to be the wormwood of the Bible in John's book of Revelation. NASA seems to at times deny such things and at other times confirm them through the discoveries they release to the public. Several scientists over time, most of whom have died, seem to crack the code. Anyway, beginning in the 1970s, studies began to try and look to history for various times of cataclysm. The Younger Dryas, the Great Flood, the destruction of Egypt, and maybe the planet by famine and pestilence. Great earthquakes and volcanoes, the mega explosions of volcanoes in the Middle Ages. The explosion of Terra led the Pope of the time to conclude that the world was under God's judgment. Some scientists found that about every 800 years there was a great cataclysm, weather event, and magnetic poles becoming perturbed and moving beyond their ordinary range, which represents the 3,600-year orbit divided by 2. Planet coming in, 1,800 years, planet going out, 1,800 years. There's evidence that the sun's heat, water levels, severity of storms, and strange weather phenomenon occur as the planet Nibiru is incoming and outgoing. Were the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia and the 2011 Japanese tsunami the climax of one of the inbound or outbound passings? Fast forward to the 1990s, a term called was coined and a move made by former Vice President Al Gore, catastrophizing that we had ruined our ozone layer in the atmosphere with CO2 from fossil fuels burning, Aquanet hairspray. We get the subjective emotional pictures of the polar bears swimming, and they're going to die because they can't get to the ice because it's all melted. I personally wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't ice right out of the camera frame. This is total speculation on my part. At that time, he gave dates that have long since passed uneventfully that had indicated at the time about cities that would be underwater, total melting of the planet's north and south polar ice, which has increased in recent years since the alarming prediction. Another common belief that may cause some of the symptoms of what the West was calling is a cycle called the 11-year solar maximum, which is responsible for increased heat and storms. Well, then we came into the next 11 years of the cycle, called the solar minimum. Cooler, more snow, ice grows back, and the nomenclature was changed from to signs posted all over the world that said, please help, by 2008, this site will be completely gone, were casually removed over time at some sites. So the solution for this worldwide problem was, of course, an international carbon tax. Forget if this was surely true. It was Big oil companies and not the average everyday person causing this. Instead, we would bear the brunt by giving our money to the benevolent secular father government at the UN international level. For the first time, the UN would have an international tax on everybody in the world. That is the rub. That's what they wanted and perhaps why the approach was taken. It would have been a big global step to give power, authority, and money to an international Congress of unelected leaders. Now, as this argument fell apart, the rhetoric has changed. There is no doubt that a 1.5 degree increase in the temperature has occurred in this century over the last 100 years. That is it. That is the horrible mystery. Even though the violent storms are a combination of cyclical patterns and the fact that the 24-hour news cycle we hear about every single event unlike ever before. This is based on about 20 highly divergent models that climate scientists use to present their findings and get government grants to work on the problem. Yet a critical thinker might go on to say, is a 1.5 degree increase a detriment to humanity? Will it cause catastrophe? How have our attempts to control Mother Nature gone in the past? So I wonder, and this is all speculation, if the powers that be were to say, look, there's this ninth planet, Nibiru, mentioned in sources throughout history. We know it's valid because the Sumerians claim to have been visited by the inhabitants of the planet that originally stuck Tiamat. And their ancient stone reliefs show the entire solar system in great detail over 6,000 years ago. Compare this to how we've only identified planets centuries ago. Heck, less than 30 years ago, Pluto was a planet but got downgraded. It's no longer apparently worthy of the status. Every 1,800 years, our planet experiences the effects of the passing. What if the attempt to get money for and frame this as is to explain the radically changing weather in a way that does not cause mass panic? The government cannot say, look, here's the deal, catastrophe is coming from space. Oh yes, and this planet has hit ours before. The entire population would devolve into horror and chaos. So this is another way. It's a manageable problem that benevolent secular father government can fix, except that the money for is going to help us. It's going to build underground bunkers and prep facilities for all the powerful to stockpile our resources for what will become the government in exile when the coasts are wiped out from the cataclysm of the passing of Nibiru. This is utter speculation on my part. I just thought it was very interesting to think about. So are you I don't know anyone who has read the evidence and does not conclude that our temperature has increased between 0.5 degree and 1.5 degrees over the last century. The question is not that. It is a 1.5 degree increase over 100 years really dangerous? Is it the most important issue that we are $20 trillion in debt with a growing population of non-natives, non-tax-paying consumers exploding by day? We'll be right back with anthropology, archaeology, and God. Stick around. Are you interested in nonfiction American history that has not been told yet? Please subscribe to John Washington's YouTube channel. John was the great-grandfather of George Washington, and the book Shipwrecked in the Land of King Tobacco tells his story for the first time. You can listen to free chapters of the audiobook there, and you can also hear analysis about the writing of this unique book. Please consider supporting this important nonfiction history on Patreon, patreon.com/shipwreckedbook. Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. Now we're going to talk about some fascinating questions about archaeology, the Bible, and the current standards, categories, and nomenclature for archaeological discovery. When watching archaeological excavations on mainstream cable, Discovery, History, etc., the explanations given about what things are seem to fall into a few categories more than any other. Monarchism, castles, artifacts of richer families, and temples and characters, and buildings that are very often identified by key factors as having something to do with their religious worships and gods and ancillary items about them. Angkor Wat in Cambodia comes to mind. Egypt, Göbekli Tepe, Tenochtitlan, Pumapunku, the pyramids found all over the world that are on specific ley lines that match a grid by longitude and latitude, that have a rhyme and reason. So right off the top, I'm excluding objective written primary sources that confirm archaeological sites for what they are. Those are obvious, legit. On some digs, we are taught that these are the gods of the certain people and the temples of worship, yet why are there by comparison fewer banks, fishermen's houses, government buildings, the Department of Jungle Management building? For a secular society that is morally relativistic and postmodern, this seems to me to contradict the general cultural view that there is no God. It leads to questions. Was God more prominent in the lives of people the further back one goes? Well, that makes sense if one has a biblical worldview. Each generation is one further separated from God. But if we look at newer ideas like those posited by Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, David Hatcher Childress, Eric von Daniken, to a degree Kent Hovind, Michael Tellinger, to name a few, many do this great work. Their work reveals that we were more advanced the further back you go. Civilizations with a celestial understanding of planets, stars, and calendars. We're just in the last few centuries getting a grasp on this ourselves. How does this happen? Is it possible that we are starting over every time one of these cataclysms from the previous story happens? Does this explain things like the Antikythera mechanism found in the Mediterranean Sea? Does that suggest primitive to advanced or advanced to more primitive? Now, I'm not saying ignore what are clearly digs that reveal Aboriginal and Native findings. Even today, there are groups like this in the Amazon. North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean comes to mind, including the many tribes in Africa that hold to their ancient ways. For those interested in spiritual anthropology, check out the primitive African tribe and their relationship to their god Rafarfu. It's fascinating. I'm talking about megalithic structures beyond current human construction technology to reproduce. Now, skeptics whose job it is to vet any new ideas and crush them based on this consensus standard in academia that seems to be prevalent now, fail to provide adequate answers, defend poor premises, and most often with the goal of protecting university funding for a desired cultural worldview taught at universities. In short, they can't admit that they might be wrong. The premise of primitive to advanced is the foundation of American archaeology for hundreds of years, and it is very well funded. What happens to those grants in the face of such a dramatic change, even if it is full of evidence? I suggest that the Joe Rogan podcast number 961 with the researcher and writer Graham Hancock, geologist Randall Carlson, and skeptic Michael Shermer. This reveals everything that we have just said with everything we can see, hear, and feel. So it must make the outcome reality, no? For the more science-minded among us, check out Randall Carlson's published paper on the Younger Dryas, written data from his trips to Greenland for ice core samples. They are fascinating. So for secular societies, archaeologists find and label so many things of God. It might be attributable to two phenomena. One, finds of art, murals, buildings, and stone that have survived and carved statuary and characters are attributed to God for religious worship. This can be a fascinating revelation about modern archaeology. This is the finest structure we've ever found. Surely the finest structure would only be for the divine. Well, that's interesting to think about because it kind of contains a contradiction. What is divine? We're postmodern, naturalistic, secular, relativistic. There isn't divine, right? So, and let me clarify, I'm sure some archaeologists are believers in God, but the system since the mid-19th century or earlier through the present has been naturalistic materialism, which has no framework for supernaturalism. It can't exist in naturalism, right? Does that mean secularists are looking at a find and going, wow, something so spectacular can only be left behind with respect to the divine? Christians are often confused of this God of the gaps thinking. And I have to tell you, I respect archaeologists so much. I know a few who are Christians and many nice people who are not. I'm just making the point. So I hope this isn't viewed as an attack. Another option is that things being found are just part of cultural or governmental ruins and misidentified. I ponder a few thoughts I used to create this process and think through this with me. So first, my perception based on what I can see, smell, hear, and touch is that churches are usually made of brick, wood, and modern material that are not going to last for thousands of years. Whereas a building like the U.S. Capitol, made of marble and stone, is sure to last at least some time, probably a millennia or longer. How would an archaeologist in 2,000 years view Statuary Hall in the Capitol? By then fading and collapsed, faded and overgrown painting of the apotheosis of George Washington in heaven with the laurels on his head. What will they say about all the statues left behind? Much like Rome had Jupiter, Zeus, Mercury, Venus in its pantheon of gods, what if they were just living people greatly respected in their time, like senators? Will they think the same thing about Roosevelt, Johnson, Truman, and Adams when they come across their statues? What about Mount Rushmore? One might say, well, primary sources would verify or back up what these things are. Well, maybe, but does paper survive cataclysm? Did ancient cultures leave records behind on stone because they were crude cavemen or because they knew etching in stone was all that would last? I often have this funny thought to myself based on the way archaeology seems to label things that they find. We could spend hours just thinking about what they would conclude if all they found of us were the little plastic containers left over that Hostess cupcakes come in. It makes me think of the tribes of people who did the head binding to model the early race of humans that had elongated skulls. Check out L.A. Marzulli for more information on that. Were these used the same way? Or were these cups that held the holy water of our divine God, you know? So I think that's kind of a funny way to look at it, but it seems a little bit true. So when these types of criticisms and modern ideas about past civilizations are brought before scientific skeptics, the answer seems to be, well, where's the broken pottery? Where are the arrow points? Clovis first, Clovis first. Look that up if you don't know what I mean. Look up Clovis theory in archaeology. Much like our modern world has done with God, we create systems of analysis that we turn on our creator who, guess what, doesn't fit because he's supernatural and our systems are naturalism. Next, the evidence does not guide the system of analysis, but the system of analysis defines and guides the understanding of the archaeological find. Let me say that one more time. The evidence does not guide the system of analysis. The system of analysis guides and categorizes the archaeological find. Therefore, technically, what is being found in the ground is not allowed to speak with its own voice. Remember, just 30 years ago, it was Columbus who discovered America somehow by landing in the Bahamas. Forget the earlier Viking expeditions that went to mainland America. Forget the ancient Egyptian artifacts found in the Grand Canyon, written in a great book by David Hatcher Childress. Forget about the Kensington runestones found by a farmer in the Midwest. And forget about the early medieval evidence of North American exploration. I wonder if any thought is given to people surviving a great cataclysm, having their entire world wiped out by flood, melt ice, or other, and the unshakable feeling that they must document what happened for the future and where it happened. What would they go for? They had just lived through Armageddon. They knew papyrus wouldn't work, no wood, no books. They carved big and in stone. That was their answer and their response. So it doesn't indicate primitive. It's all they had to communicate with. So the effect of time would be minimized in that result. This is the more reason to think outside the box on every archaeological project, because through that lens, this is not evidence of primitive to advanced, but common sense. We'll be right back with the last part of the show. Please come over to amazon.com/author/nicholasdgarrett and check out the library of works from the Just Tell Me the Truth About Christianity series. Very informative and fun reads, inexpensive, available in paperback and for your Kindle. Everyone, thanks for sticking around for the last installment. Now, friends, looking ahead to Podcast 13. As those of you who have followed me for a long time know, one of the inconsistencies in my theological position centers on biblical inerrancy. I wrote about its lack of modern apologetics as one of the reasons for the decline of Christianity in the West. I've used the example that, in my opinion, the doctrine of sufficiency has somehow been stretched to mean that the Bible is all we need for all things, instead of the doctrine's design that the Bible is sufficient unto salvation, which it is. When I was born again and converted, the Bible is where I went to learn about what had happened to me, found the gospel, and ended up making a profession of faith as a Christian, born again, baptized, as the Bible says. But after seminary, I felt no closer to the answer I thought was so important at the time, and what is the absolute truth? That process is written about in the Just Tell Me the Truth About Christianity series of books on Amazon, amazon.com/author/nicholasdgarrett. After writing that, my inerrancy problem only grew. Peter says Scripture was of no private interpretation, and I've seen that most often used to defend inerrancy because of the context of the rest of the passage. But I've also seen of no private interpretation to mean an individual cannot make modern connections from their own life to define meaning in the Bible or allegorize. In other words, one cannot claim a dream from God that tells them to do something contrary to Scripture and teach it or act on it. Those are two different uses. Is that bad hermeneutic? I used the analogy that the Bible was like staring at a 6-inch square of a mural and insisting it's the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Then, after some critical thinking, I stood back and noticed that the mural covered 2 city blocks and contained so much more. So I came to this conclusion that said, look, if I can find good primary sources early in the church that explain this process of Jesus Christ as the Word, somehow becoming the Word, and what that looked like, because the Word is Bible and is Christ, and was with God in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, English song, the word, in Egyptian, in English, it's the word. In Egyptian, it's song. In Hindu, it's om. I found this interesting, and it might point to some somatic and frequency in the creation of the natural world. Check out Michael Tellinger on that, too. Anyway, so there's a lot of evidence for it. I always said if I could find a strong systemic theology and soteriology connecting Jesus as the Word and early, I can come around to biblical inerrancy. Now, after long last, I believe I have found that, in addition to Scripture among the church fathers. Most of Podcast 13 will be devoted to talking about that. It will be included in a broader discussion on why people don't go to church anymore. That's a bit of a deceiving title. Many do go, in fact, often the most devout. I'll show how the capitalist system and televangelism using Christianity from the 50s through the present bred the idea that if a church didn't have thousands of members, it wasn't healthy. And now I know better. Perhaps we've looked at that whole thing incorrectly. So the topic subheadings for the next podcast target these categories for why people don't go to church anymore. 1, 7 reasons pastorship is failing. 2, the collapse of doctrinal consistency and authority over truth claims. 3, misunderstandings of doctrinal application and poor hermeneutic, the problem of inerrancy. 4, secular globalism and its impact on the faith. 5, soul care. 6, pastoral understanding of denominationalism. 7, recreating communication styles in preaching to meet the new way people perceive reality. A few videos you can watch leading up to the next podcast can be found in the video description. A 2-part video called The Problem with Inerrancy. It may show up here. I'm trying to embed the link and learn how to do that, but if that doesn't work, just check in the video description. Finally, in honor of July 4th, 1776, the day we claimed independence from Great Britain and embarked on the great experience of pursuing a republic. Although we had articles first. I know there's a lot of details, but here's what I'm saying. So I wanted to read you a few excerpts of the Declaration of Independence, just the beginning part mainly. The Declaration of Independence was a collaborative effort. Thomas Jefferson was the primary writer. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams helped him to edit it. And then it went before the committee where they edited it some more. Then it went before the full body where I think further edits took place. But he gives a preface or prelude, writes the reasons for the break with the king, and then he ends it by saying, we pledge our lives and our fortunes in sacred honor together, and the signer's sign. So here it is. It's beautiful language. Happy Independence Day, friends. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to these separations. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, or to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem to them that will seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms in which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. He goes on to say, such have been the patient sufferings of your colonies. And he goes on to say, let facts be submitted to a candid world, and then gives a laundry list against the King of Britain about why they're separating. Anyway, thank you for listening to this long podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.